Caesarian town, late morning. The road shimmered with heat, dust curling in short gusts along the cracked edges of the curb. A dog came limping from the far end, ribs sharp under patchy fur, one back leg barely touching the ground. He moved unevenly, panting hard, head low to the ground. No bark, no cry. Just the scrape of nails against stone and the faint splatter of blood that marked each step. Market voices paused, then resumed. A woman shifted her basket. A child looked up, then looked away. The dog didn't stop for any of them. He crossed the open path between fruit stands and maize stalls, trailing a thread of red behind him. One leg dragged more than stepped. His eyes scanned without focusing, wide but dull, as if looking for something he couldn't yet find. Near the second cart, beside a cracked cement drain, he stopped. Not because he wanted to. His body folded suddenly as if a string had snapped inside him. He slumped forward, breath catching in the dust. The blood beneath him pooled slower now, thicker, darker. A man had just set down his sack of carrots. His name was Elias. He wore an old shirt stained from years of lifting burlap. He didn't speak. He didn't look around. He simply knelt, slowly, letting the shadow from his frame fall gently across the animal. The dog raised his head once, barely, then dropped it again with a soft, wheezing tremor. His ears twitched. Not alert, just reacting to movement. A fly landed near the corner of his eye. Elias shifted his bag, pulled out a folded rag and placed it near the dog's front paw. The animal didn't flinch. Only his sides moved now, rising unevenly with each breath. He wasn't emaciated from birth. The lines along his haunches showed a body once full, once fed. But it had been days, maybe weeks. The limp told of a break or a deep wound. The scent of dried blood clung to the heat. Someone from a nearby stall muttered something, low and short. Elias didn't answer. He reached into the side of his sack, pulled out a small plastic bowl meant for washing fruit, and tipped the rest of his own water bottle into it. Then, without pushing, he set it just beside the dog's nose. The scent reached first, then the tongue. A slow movement, hesitant, almost lazy, not from calm, but weakness. The dog licked once, then twice, then pressed his mouth shakily into the water as if unsure if it would stay. He drank in shallow, uneven gulps. Half of it spilled onto the dirt. Elias watched the leg more closely now. A puncture, not fresh, just behind the thigh, crusted edges around torn fur. No infection yet, but close. The dog's paws were scraped raw at the tips, as if he'd traveled a long way without rest. No rope marks, no collar, not dumped, not chased, just left. Or maybe he left something behind. The dog stopped drinking. His tongue fell from his mouth slightly, too tired to tuck it back. He looked at Elias, just once, then dropped his head fully to the ground, breathing with effort. Still alive, still watching. If he moved again, the wound might tear wider. If he stayed too long in this heat, the blood loss alone could finish what the road had started. Either way, the time to decide wasn't far. Elias stood slowly and stepped around him, shielding the dog from the passing crowd. A boy passed behind, looked down, and kept walking. The market didn't stop, but for a moment, just at the bend in the road, one life had halted completely. The dog didn't ask for help. He collapsed near someone who might listen. The dust stayed still around his body. The trail behind him had stopped bleeding, but the eyes, though dim, had not yet closed. Elias didn't touch the dog. He let the bowl rest near the paws, half full, not tilted, letting the scent of water speak first. The dog remained still for a long while, nose quivering, ribs rising too fast. One paw shifted, then the other. The head lowered with a faint tremble, ears twitching not from alertness but effort. A long, rough breath escaped him before his tongue reached the edge. The water rippled once, then again. It wasn't thirst in the usual sense. It was survival. His jaw barely moved. Only the sound of shallow laps and the tremor in his hind leg betrayed how weak he was. The ground beneath him darkened slightly from the spill. His chest flattened against the dust, still panting. Flies gathered near the corners of his eyes, slow and undisturbed. Elias kept one knee down, watching without intrusion. No rope mark around the neck, no tag, no sign of ownership. But the coat, even matted, showed signs of care from another time. Short hairs where a collar might have once been, cleaner fur around the shoulders. A dog who had known people. A dog who had walked away or been left behind. Maybe both. Elias moved only when the dog looked away. He reached into his bag again, pulled out an old rag he kept for fruit stains, and folded it once before tucking it under the side of the dog's hip. The dog let out a single, strained whine. Short and sharp, eyes flicking toward the touch but not rising in protest. The sound was not fear. It was memory. A protest against something he couldn't explain in movement anymore. Then his body settled again. That was when Elias noticed the second mark. Low on the flank, near the base of the tail. A crusted patch, fur clumped thick around it. Dried blood, not fresh. The skin had darkened slightly at the edges, a sign of clotting that hadn't held. If disturbed, it might open again. If left alone, it risked infection. Either way, the dog wouldn't last another full day outside. Not in this state. The crowd had thinned. Midday heat kept most people under shade. A woman called out faintly from across the lane. Elias didn't answer. His hand hovered near the wound but didn't touch it. The dog's body had begun to cool beneath the layer of dust, legs stretched unevenly as if they had lost sense of their own shape. Still, the eyes remained open. Not watching Elias, but something behind him. Unseen. Distant. Elias followed the gaze for a moment, scanning the narrow road behind. Nothing moved, just shadows against rusted tin sheets, empty baskets stacked near the edge of the maze stall. But the dog didn't stop looking. Every few seconds his ears shifted weakly in that direction, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. He tried to lift his head once more, but the strain proved too much. He gave a low grunt and dropped his chin back down to the bowl. Elias leaned closer, resting both hands on his knees. "It's okay," he whispered. Only that. Then silence again. The risks hadn't changed. If the wound deepened, the dog would bleed again. If infection set in, his strength would fall faster than they could move him. And if he had left something behind, another animal, a pup, a memory, then whatever it was, it still held his gaze. Elias didn't move to pick him up. Not yet. He waited. The dog blinked slowly once, then turned his head. Just a few inches. Toward the road he'd come from. Then, as if recalling something important, he shifted his weight forward. His legs barely held, but the message was clear. He wasn't finished. The dog stood with effort, front legs trembling as he pulled himself upright. He took one step, then another, favoring the uninjured side. Dust clung to the blood at his haunch as the wound reopened faintly, but he didn't stop. He paused halfway to the edge of the road and turned his head toward Elias, not with urgency. Just expectation. The message was clear. He wasn't resting here. He had stopped only long enough to be seen. Elias adjusted the strap on his shoulder and stepped away from the market path. The sounds behind them softened. The murmur of traders, the clatter of crates, as the dog led them down the broken verge and toward the back lanes behind the maze stall. The heat was sharp now. Cicadas rattled in the brush. One of the vendors called out, asking if everything was all right, but Elias didn't answer. The dog walked in short, halting bursts, each stretched no more than 10 paces before he turned to be sure Elias was still coming. The terrain shifted. Dry grass growing in cracks between broken cement, small thorn branches brushing their path. It wasn't a road the dog was used to taking. His pace was uneven. head lowered, tail slack behind him. But his eyes stayed forward, always looking toward the same bend ahead, just beyond the edge of a leaning fence where runoff from the last rain had hollowed the ground into a shallow trough. Elias noticed how the dog's breathing never steadied. The ribs moved fast beneath the thinning coat. Once the dog stumbled. The front paw gave under loose gravel and he dropped hard onto one shoulder. He didn't yelp, just paused, steadied his breath, and pushed back up with effort that made the old wound weep fresh blood. Elias moved forward, hand raised slightly, but the dog had already righted himself. He looked back again, not in fear, just to make sure the man was still there. If the dog fell again, and harder, the injury might worsen. If he was pushing himself for too long, the loss of blood could turn. There was no certainty in the direction, but something was pulling him. Some reason he hadn't collapsed under the heat. They passed an abandoned wooden table, overturned and half buried in thorn brush. A piece of blue fabric clung to one of its legs. The dog walked slower now. The wind had dropped, leaving only the sound of Elias's boots brushing through dry weed. The dog's tongue hung sideways, no longer licking the air, just dragging loosely. Flies returned to his back, unbothered by the little twitch in his skin. Then he stopped, not because he couldn't go further, but because they had arrived. A slight downward slope dipped toward a shadowed curve in the roadside, a collapsed corner of ground where two planks of timber had fallen inward, forming a narrow V of shelter beneath a broken fruit crate. Elias looked past him, but didn't step in. The dog stood still for a moment, chest heaving, one front leg shaking with effort. Then he turned his body slightly and gave a single, low whine, not loud enough for distance, but not for Elias, for whatever lay beyond the fallen wood. He waited, just waited, and looked back once more, this time with nothing left in his eyes but need. The wind passed softly through the tall grass beside them. Elias stepped forward. The flies rose briefly from the dog's side, then settled again. He crouched low, steadying himself on one knee, and moved the plank gently aside with the edge of his boot. The space beneath was dark, damp, and still. The dog lowered himself to the ground again, slow, like a body returning to the place it was built to protect. Elias leaned forward into the quiet. The sound came low. Barely part of the air, a single whimper rising from beneath the broken edge of wood. Elias stilled. The dog beside him didn't move, only lowered his body again onto the ground, front legs stretched forward, head resting against the dust. His breathing was shallow now, more effort than air, but the sound from below had changed things. It hadn't come from him. Elias crouched beside the slope, his eyes adjusting to the dim space beneath the collapsed crate. It wasn't a full stall, just the remnants. Warped timber, two splintered legs, a bent sheet of tin half buried in loose gravel. Shade pooled beneath the mess, and there, tucked into the corner against the side wall of the ditch, was another body. A smaller one. The second dog lay curled tightly, ribs barely moving. Her coat was darker but faded in patches. And one side of her abdomen was swollen, the fur around it matted with grit. Her legs didn't shift. Her ears didn't rise. She looked like she'd been there for hours, or more. Only the occasional flicker of her side, a breath too slow to be called breathing, proved she hadn't yet gone. Elias moved slowly, keeping his hands low. He lifted a thin piece of wood from the edge, letting the light fall just a little farther into the shadow. The pup didn't react. She remained in place, her head tipped forward, chin resting in the dirt. Her eyes didn't blink. But her chest rose again, once, and the softest moan caught in her throat, a dry, scraping sound. It wasn't a call, it was what was left of one. The male beside Elias whined again, a short, breathy sound. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to say he had brought someone. Then he pulled himself closer to the edge and let his body lie still. He pressed his front paws into the slope, nose pointing toward the pup, not touching. A space remained between them, but not for long. Elias looked between the two. There was no blood on the second dog's legs, but her side was too round, too still. The swelling might have been internal or the early signs of infection. She hadn't eaten in days. Her paws showed no wear. She hadn't walked to this place. She had been carried, or had fallen, or had simply stopped. He eased down into the slope, feet steady, weight spread across the gravel. The smell below was faint, dust, decay, and the bitter trace of dried wound. Elias slipped the tip of his rag beneath the edge of her chest, lifting gently. She didn't resist. Her body shifted like fabric, limp with exhaustion. One paw twitched, then stilled again. The risk was immediate. If she was moved without care, she might stop breathing entirely. If she stayed here much longer, she would fade. The sun had crept higher, and the heat now pressed against the side of the ditch with quiet insistence. Even the flies had grown lazy in the warmth. The male dog gave a final sound, not a bark, not a growl. Just one long breath that broke into a faint exhale at the end. He hadn't followed Elias by accident. He had come to fetch help. Elias reached carefully beneath the pup and folded her against his chest. Her body barely stirred. He glanced back at the male. The dog's eyes didn't leave her. His ears flattened. He rose slowly and followed as Elias stepped up out of the ditch. There were no wagging tails, no reunion, just the sound of breathing, shallow, trembling, and the quiet movement of paws in the dust behind him. At the top of the slope, the three paused. The wind had picked up just enough to rustle the edge of the dry maize leaves scattered along the roadside. Nothing else moved. Elias crouched fully now, one knee in the dirt, the small cloth from his bag spread open beside him. The female's body was lighter than he expected. She did not stir at first as he eased his hands beneath her, arms sliding under her chest and hips in a slow, practiced movement. Her head lolled gently against his wrist, her breath catching once as if unsure whether to continue. The swell at her side had faded under closer inspection. Not bloat, not disease. Just hunger, absence, and the way skin collapses when life has left it too long. The male stayed close, not touching, but near enough that his shadow stretched just over her back. His eyes were set, dry and red at the edges but fixed. He did not blink as Elias adjusted the cloth beneath her side. The wound above her foreleg had stopped bleeding, but the skin there had split in a way that suggested pressure or impact. An old bruise turned sore from stillness. She was holding on, but just barely. Elias steadied his weight and shifted her slightly toward him. The edge of the broken crate creaked under his movement. And then something moved. Not her. Something under. It was nearly invisible at first, a tremor in the shade, a faint push of fur against the cloth that hadn't come from his hands. Elias froze, then leaned lower. Beneath the mother's thin front leg, tucked so tightly into the crook of her body it had seemed part of her, was another shape. Small, curved, and trembling. A pup, no more than a day old, maybe less. Its eyes were shut, ears pressed flat against its skull, and its breath came so faintly it seemed like wind. It didn't cry. It didn't crawl. It simply nudged closer to the warmth of her chest, unaware of anything else. Its body was slick and barely covered in soft down. The mother's leg twitched, and she let out a low grunt, not alarm, not pain. Just the sound of something reaching the edge of endurance. Elias exhaled once and sat back on his heels. The situation had shifted. It was no longer one animal near collapse. There were now two, and one of them, so new to the world, could not survive the dust, the heat, or even the wind without shelter. If the mother's body cooled too quickly, the pup would follow. If they moved too roughly, either could fail. There was no margin left. He pulled off the light wrap from around his neck and laid it flat across his forearm, then gently used one hand to cup the pup, pressing it to the mother's side. It barely moved, only letting out one soft grunt as it settled into the fabric. Elias lifted the mother again with new care, this time shaping her body around the tiny one cradled against her ribs. The male stepped forward once, then stopped again. His body trembled just once, and his back leg folded slightly before he steadied himself. Still, he did not move closer. Elias said just 3 words, barely above the air. "You're not alone." Then he stood. The weight was unbalanced now. The mother limp but long, the pup feather-light but fragile. He held them both close, one hand gripping beneath the ribs, the other wrapped around the cloth. The male turned with him. He did not walk beside, only followed with space between. If Elias stumbled now, the pup could be crushed. If he moved too quickly, the mother might lose the rhythm of her breath. If the male lagged behind, he might not make the journey back at all. The risk was layered and real. Dust curled again along the edges of the roadside. The air hung still. Elias began the slow walk home. The male followed at a distance of 5 steps, head low, tail dragging a single line through the earth. Behind them, the overturned crate rested empty beneath the shadow of a leaning post. The road back felt longer. Elias adjusted his grip every few steps, shifting the mother's weight without jostling the pup tucked between her chest and the crook of his arm. His shirt had been wrapped around the newborn. Secured by a fold at the shoulder, its hem damp where the tiny body had pressed in. The cloth moved slightly with each breath. A good sign, but still too shallow to trust. The mother made no sound, her head resting against his wrist, eyes barely open, her ribs rising with slow resistance. Her legs hung loose, not limp from death but from the edge of exhaustion. The male followed 10 steps behind. His gait was worse now, the drag in his back leg more pronounced with each patch of gravel. But he didn't stop. His head stayed forward, ears flat, tongue low. Once or twice he paused, nose lifting faintly to scent the wind. But always, when Elias turned to check, the dog was moving again. Silent, determined, never looking away for long. Market voices softened as they approached. The air had thickened with midday heat, and more people now leaned in shaded corners fanning themselves with folded paper. When Elias passed, a few glanced toward him. One man stood still, eyes narrowing at the shape in his arms. A woman stepped aside without speaking. The child from earlier pointed once, then clung to her mother's skirt. The weight Elias carried was not loud, but it held something that made people step back. Not from fear, from something else. A quiet they couldn't name. The male never broke stride. He didn't flinch when a cart creaked nearby, didn't pause when a voice called across the road. He kept his eyes on the space just in front of Elias's heels, nose low, legs stiff. His body was trembling now, slightly and constantly. Dust clung to the blood on his flank, forming a dull crust that cracked at each movement. If he stopped, his body might settle into stillness. But he didn't. By the time they reached the alley behind Elias's stall, the sun had moved just enough to throw shadow along the side wall. Elias pushed open the back gate with one shoulder. The mat he used for sorting produce had already been laid out, rough burlap folded twice on top of a flat crate board. Not clean, but dry. Safe enough for now. He lowered himself onto one knee and eased the mother down first, keeping her curled gently around the cloth. Her legs twitched once as they met the ground, then folded inward. The pup shifted, nose pressing into her belly, still without opening its eyes. Elias unwound the shirt and let it stay bunched beneath them both. The male stood at the edge of the mat. He didn't lie down. His chest rose too quickly, his sides twitching with every breath. He blinked for the first time in minutes, then looked away from Elias and back toward the alley. He didn't seem to know what to do with his body now. Elias reached behind him and opened a shallow basin of water. He nudged it closer to the male without words. The dog stepped forward slowly, lapped 3 times, then sat beside the mat with a groan that came from his hips more than his throat. He didn't touch the mother, just stayed near. The sun touched the top of the shop wall, throwing long shapes over the alley floor. A fly hovered near the pup's nose but was brushed away by the shift of fur as the mother exhaled. For now, they had time. Not certainty, not safety, but time. A breeze passed through the alley carrying the scent of maize and soil. The male lowered his head slightly and closed his eyes. The dust no longer moved. The heat had begun to ease by late afternoon, the air no longer pressing but still thick with the scent of dust and dried husks from the nearby sacks of maize. Elias sat against the shaded wall of the shop, arms resting on his knees, eyes never far from the mat where the 3 lay. He hadn't moved them since setting them down, only added a folded cloth near the edge to block the wind, though the breeze was faint and mostly warm. He'd offered water once more to the male. It had been taken without pause. Beyond that, he had done nothing but watch. The mother's body had barely shifted for hours. Her chest rose and fell, slow and even, sometimes interrupted by a long pause that made Elias lean forward to be sure she hadn't stopped. Her front paw had curled slightly beneath her belly, where the pup now pressed in, nose burrowed into fur, still stiff from dried fluid. The tiny body shivered once, then settled, its breathing so light it barely lifted the cloth beneath it. Each movement from the pup sparked a faint stir from the mother, an eye twitch, a change in breath, but not waking. Not yet. The male hadn't sat down for most of the day. He remained near the edge of the mat, upright though his weight shifted constantly from one foreleg to the other. His head dipped low, nose twitching near the pup every few minutes, then pulling back. His eyes were dull now. Not dead, just drained. A body that had burned through its final reserve of urgency and was waiting for permission to stop holding on. The light changed slowly, fading toward the blue-gold tones of evening. Somewhere down the alley, a bowl clanged against concrete, and a goat called out once behind a closed stall. Elias didn't move. He watched the mother's eyes. They opened gently, without strain. One blink, then another. The gaze remained unfocused at first, tilted downward toward the folded edge of cloth where her chin rested. Then she turned her head slightly. Her breath caught. The pup had crawled closer again, barely moving, its mouth brushing the thin fur of her belly. Her paw shifted and rose just enough to curl protectively around it. Then she looked up. Her eyes met Elias's across the quiet. No alarm, no strain, just a soft awareness. Her face held stillness, though the space between her brows tightened with a twitch of effort. She didn't try to rise, she didn't make a sound. But the moment stretched between them like something that needed no shape to be understood. She blinked once more, then turned her head again, this time toward the male. He had already moved. Without sound or signal, the male stepped closer, lowering his front legs first, then the rest of his body with deliberate, aching care. His side pressed softly against the edge of the mat. His head dipped once near the mother's neck, but he didn't nudge her. He only let his shoulder rest beside hers, then lowered his face to the cloth. He didn't sleep, but he stayed. Elias leaned forward and checked the mother's side. The wound beneath the foreleg had sealed for now, not deep enough to tear through muscle, but enough to need rest. The fever had not returned. Her ears lifted briefly as his hand passed near her back, then flattened again as she settled into the warmth of her own still body. The pup gave a soft cry, no louder than a rustle, and the mother's leg curled tighter. They didn't look like recovery yet, but they no longer looked like loss. Evening shadows stretched across the alley, drawing long, soft lines through the dust. A loose thread on the edge of the cloth lifted in the breeze, then dropped again against the mat. Elias didn't move. The family had found stillness, and in that, for now, They had time. The first rain came quietly, long before light. It wasn't the kind that battered rooftops or carved channels in the dirt. It arrived as a hush, soft and steady, falling on old tin sheets and empty crates like a memory being placed back where it belonged. The air smelled new by the time dawn reached the alley behind the stall. It carried the clean scent of soaked maize, earth loosened from its hardened crust, and something more distant, the faint trace of open space beyond the town. Inside, the shop stayed dark. Elias hadn't opened it yet. He didn't need to. He had known from the moment he unlatched the back door. The mat was empty. The cloth he'd kept tucked around its corner had been dragged slightly off the crate, flattened by weight no longer there. No sound rose from the alley, no breathing, no shuffle of paws, just the soft drip of rainwater collecting at the corner of the gutter and the occasional creak of wind against the back gate. He stepped outside barefoot, his shirt collar still damp from sleep. The rain had slowed, but not stopped. It rushed his shoulders in fine mist, soaking into the woven grain of the burlap that now lay bare. He didn't search, he didn't call out. He looked down. Paw prints marked the edge of the alley, clean and unmistakable. Not just one, but 3. The small ones staggered slightly, lighter than the others as if still unsure of their own shape. The mothers were firm, set close to her pups, and the males trailed behind, larger, with a drag at the back left, the same uneven mark that had trailed him since the day he limped into the market dust. They hadn't gone far at first. The prints circled once beneath the old fruit crate, then moved east toward the bend near the maize stall. Elias followed only to the point where the footprints met the road. There, the trail thinned, blending into the wet gravel and soft soil beyond the footpath. They hadn't looked back. For 3 weeks, he had let them be. He fed them in silence, left shallow bowls of water at the back door, checked wounds only when necessary. He never lifted the pup once she'd begun to walk, never reached out to pat the male or call the mother to him. They came and went from the mat, slept under shade, sometimes beside each other, sometimes apart. The pup grew slowly, legs still trembling even near the end. The mother began to stand without pause. The male's limp never left, but his eyes grew clear again. Elias did not give them names. If they had stayed, they would have had shelter, food, safety, but nothing that belonged to the wild truly remains where the walls don't end, and nothing that walks away without chains should be asked to return with one. Elias stood at the roadside a little longer, hands folded behind his back, letting the drizzle settle into the creases of his shirt. The town was still asleep. Only a few doors had cracked open. A rooster called once across the far end of the lane, and past that, beyond the bend and out toward the open hills, a line of clean earth waited, washed free of dust, quiet beneath the gray sky. He didn't speak. He didn't follow. The prints faded into the tall grass past the rise. The rain kept falling. The cloth on the mat stayed soaked. The alley was still.